Welcome back. How far back can you trace your ancestors? 4, 5, 6 generations? Discovering your roots can reveal things you never anticipated, but for a lot of people, all the work can seem overwhelming.
That's what I put, T-O-N-E-Y.
2 months ago, we introduced you to Prince George's Genealogical Society.
So I was able to find out where my father's family, they came from Prussia in 1872.
Tonight and tomorrow, we are going to give you a quick how-to course on genealogical research. What is genealogical research?
It's an investigation into the history of a particular family.
There are several ways of collecting your material: word of mouth, in-person visits to a courthouse or state archives. You can also do much of it online. There are sites like FamilySearch.org, which is free. Others may be fee-based. Cal Burgett says begin with what you know.
Well, you start talking to your family. You write down what you know. You know who your parents were. Do you know when they got married? You know when they were born. So you get that information, and then you ask them about their parents and their brothers and sisters. Then you advance, if your grandparents are still alive, you talk to your grandparents and see what information they have. And branch out to aunts and uncles and cousins and try to see as much information you can.
You can start by making a family chart, noting parents, siblings, children, births, and death dates. It can be text only, or it can include pictures. My tree includes photographs. This is my mom, who was born in New Jersey, and this is my dad, who was born in Harlem in 1930. And this is a great-grandfather from Cuba. Thus far, I've been able to log 8 generations. Burgett suggests having realistic goals.
If I decided, well, I want to find all the ancestors of my parents, that's too broad. You're never going to find it all. So you try to set realistic goals. So your goal might be, well, I want to find out the country of origin for my father's family and when they arrived in America.
Here's an example of how it's done. Census records contain a lot of information. So say I want to find the census record a listing of my great-grandmother. I already know her name was Nettie Harrison, so I type in her name along with where she lived. Some records can be difficult to read, but in the 1880s you can see she and her husband were farm laborers, and I know that it's her because the other names check out. This is her picture. She was born in Alabama in the 1840s. And this is her son, John Harrison. He was a large landowner, and in the 1950s, seated at the far left, he was on the board of directors of the Edgecombe County Credit Union.
Document everything, where you found it. You want to know the book you found it in, who wrote it, when it was published, what page you found the information on.
Now, in the 8 years I've been researching, I discovered first cousins in Philadelphia, a college president in Ohio, an alleged bootlegger, as well as Pullman porters, and a surviving son of a great-grand-uncle who was born in 1880. Well, as we told you last night, more and more people are searching their ancestral roots. Tonight, we continue our genealogical series with a look at documents and following the leads. In yesterday's segment, we talked about assembling a family chart with names and dates. I showed you pictures of my tree, along with Mom in this photo from 1953, and then my dad, who looks like he's bound for Hollywood.
So you gather as much of that type of information as you can before you really start looking.
Tonight, we're going to begin with more advice from Carol Burgett of the Prince George's Genealogical Society. She says have a plan that's manageable.
Well, I'm going to review all the census records to see if I can find them and trace them as far back as I can. And maybe in that, I'm going to find out what country they came from.
In addition to assembling a family tree, Burgett says it's a good idea to gather as many documents as possible because they can lead you to more information. Relatives can also be a resource, which is how I got this British passport from my great-uncle, Stephen Bowen, who was born in Jamaica, British West Indies in 1888. Again, information can be collected at libraries, state archives, and county courthouses or online.
Document everything where you found it.
Well, why is that
You should
important?
collect it. Because if you have to ever go back and check it, you're lost and you waste a lot of time trying to find it again.
If you don't document it.
Right.
Last night we showed you my great-grandfather, James A. St. John, who was born in Cuba. Research of Census Records led me to the naturalization papers for his father, Arthur St. John, who was born in Puerto Rico in 1847 and came to Key West in 1878. An online search led me also to the naturalization papers for Stephen Bowen. Again, he was born in Jamaica. The record shows he emigrated from Cuba on a ship named the Danube. And while you will uncover a lot of great information, it's likely you'll discover some drama.
The first woman to be executed in Georgia was in part of my mother's family line.
To that end, the death certificate for a second great-uncle indicated he died by suicide. Having concerns, it was a southern city, I contacted a library and got newspaper articles. The Charlotte Daily Observer says he was found at the bottom of a river with a gun in his hand. But look at the subheading. The date was June 23, 1910. His name was Shedrick Hargrove. City directories, which are available in libraries, are annual records. They can tell you where someone was living between the census years, and that was how I found Shedrick Hargrove's widow, who eventually moved north to Springfield, Massachusetts, where she worked as a domestic, and in the 1920s was charged with, but found innocent of, bootlegging. What do you enjoy about doing this research?
Some of my favorite things to do are to study and read history and mystery novels. Mm-hmm. This combines both.
And while many people can trace their lines back several centuries for African Americans, slavery can often, but not always, mean the end of the trail. Our next segment will look at Black genealogy and DNA.
Well, our genealogical series continues tonight with a look at challenges facing Black Americans who are trying to trace their roots beyond 1870. The hurdles can be rightly America's birth defect known as slavery. We're also going to talk about getting beyond the paper trail.
The organization was founded in 1977.
Carolyn Rowe is with the Prince George's chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society.
We present programs throughout the county to community organizations, churches, civic groups, you name it, family reunions.
Tonight, on the third and final segment of our series, we are going to look at Black genealogy and the hurdles researchers face.
The main roadblock is of course, slavery for most of us, but not all of us.
The first time the names of blacks were listed on census records, unless they were free, was 1870. George and Della Hargrove were my second great-grandparents. Prior to 1870, slaves were denied the basic dignity of a name on a census record. This is an 1850 slave schedule. Note James Hargrove of Edgecombe County, North Carolina. He owned 19 slaves. Human property reduced to a hash mark, age, and gender. So where does one go when the trail ends? Rose says if you know where your ancestors came from, look for a slave owner in that area. My great-grandmother, Nettie Harrison, was a slave from Alabama.
I would look for a white family in Alabama with that surname. If I know the city and town that she lived in Alabama and the county, I would look for white people with that name. I would get a history book on the county to see who were the first inhabitants.
Rowe also researched what's known as Cohabitation Records. You can find them in courthouses and state archives.
1866, there was a law, an act of the General Assembly in North Carolina in March of 1866 that mandated persons who had been cohabitating together should come before a justice of the peace and declare themselves as husband and wife.
That was how she located her fourth great-grandparents, Thomas and Polly Fry.
My fourth great-grandparents came forward in 1866 and said they had been living together since 1816. They had belonged to a Nicholas Fry. They had been with him, thank God, for 50 years as husband and wife, which is most unusual because so often the slaves were sold away from each other.
When the paper trail ends, you can turn to science, more specifically DNA analysis. It can tell you where your ancestors came from. One of Rose's relatives had theirs tested.
Primarily black. I forgot the percentage. It's like 90-some% black, sub-Saharan African a smidgen of European.
I also had my DNA tested. The results were complex and a bit surprising. I'm 65% African, mostly Nigerian, but also with DNA prevalent in Ivory Coast and Ghana, which means I have distant relatives from that region. I'm also 32% European, with distant relatives from the United Kingdom, Ireland, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Finland. The rest is 2% Native American and 1% Pacific Islander. So it sounds like it takes a lot of work.
It does. It takes a lot of time. It's really not as fast as it looks on TV, unless you got a full staff of complementary people to do it. But if you're doing it on your own, it's going to take some time.
If you would like more on how to find more information, you can contact the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society at aahgs.org.